like telling Bible stories, especially from the Old Testament. Those really tend to capture our imagination, and many of them are so vivid as to what exactly happened in such detail. And the plagues is one of those Bible stories that I remember learning back from when I was a kid in Bible class. Learning about the 10 plagues and how crazy it would be for some of these things to happen. And then growing up and reading it specifically for myself in full, and noticing some of those little details that we like to notice about how things really were. I remember thinking about, the darkness. Well, when you read about it, and we'll get to it, it wasn't a darkness over everything, an eclipse or something like that, where we think of something natural. But a lot of these plagues, it was happening only in the land of Egypt. Goshen was where the Hebrews lived. A Pharaoh 430 some odd years before we get to the plagues and Moses gave that land to Joseph and his family. And so now that was where all the Hebrews lived. And so it was up until about the fourth plague on. Those things only happened in Egypt. It didn't happen to the Hebrews living there. So you picture the scene of the darkness, where it says that the Hebrews had light, the Israelites had light, whereas in the land of Egypt they had none. And it looks to me like they couldn't light a candle. They didn't get out of bed because it was so dark. You ever been deep down into a cave? Or the scene of the frogs. Can you imagine having the frogs everywhere like that? What I want us to think about for this lesson this morning is not just to engage in the scenes that are before us, in those things that happened all those years ago, but to consider where you stand in these scenarios. Do you stand with Pharaoh and the Egyptians? Or do you stand with Moses and Aaron and God? Is your heart hardened? Are you hardening your heart? Or do you want to go and worship the one true living God? Because we still face those same things today. We may not face physical plagues the way they face here, but we do have a choice. We have a choice depending on where we want to, whose side we want to be on. I don't remember where I read this. I looked in some of the commentaries that I thought it could be in, and I couldn't find it. But I know I read it. I'm not just making this up. But some of the plagues, I'm not going to say all of them, but some of the plagues represented things that the Egyptians would have worshipped, or protections that the Egyptians would have worshipped. And so as the river is turned to blood, or as the livestock are killed, that would have been some sort of protection from some sort of god that they worshipped. And so imagine being an Egyptian and your religious beliefs being directly contradicted by this man Moses and Aaron and the God that they preach on. Imagine believing in some sort of deity that would protect your livestock in the field if you made these certain sacrifices. And then here comes hail, or boils, or the cattle are dying. And now all of a sudden it's like, well, wait, magicians, you said, or priests, you said that if I made this sacrifice to Ra or whoever it was, that my stuff would be protected, and now it's not, because of Moses' God. So before we get there, Moses has already gone to Pharaoh, and Aaron have already gone and have said, let the people go, and he even shows them a sign. Kind of a benign sign, a non-threatening, not a hey, we're going to punish you kind of a sign, but I'm going to throw this rod down and it's going to turn into a snake. The problem with Pharaoh that we're going to see up until about the fourth plague is that his magicians could do all those same things. And now, there's some movies that have come out. There's one cartoon that a bunch of famous people made up, the Prince of Egypt. And I kind of like the way they depict it. Because Moses is there facing off with Pharaoh, who was his stepbrother, his adopted brother in this movie. I don't know that that was the case, but it's possible that that was the case, that this Pharaoh would have grown up with Moses. Or, at the very least, he would have known about Moses. It's not like he had been gone that long. But we see Moses doing these miracles through God. But the magicians are doing the same thing. And in the scriptures, it doesn't act like, as some of the movies would do, like they do some sort of smoke and mirrors like a magician today would do. You know, David Copperfield, you know, or some card trick, or making the woman be sawn in half, but really it's two women in the box. But it just indicates that they did the same thing. That's a little scary to me. The Bible doesn't say that they were not real magicians. It just says the Pharaoh's magicians were able to do the same thing. And so they make this snake out of a rod as well. And the difference was though that Moses' snake ate their snakes. And so we pick up here in chapter 7 with this water turning to blood. And as we look through this scene, we're not going to take the time, we won't have time to read all the way through chapter 14, where we're going to get to, hopefully. But some of the things I want to point out here. It wasn't just the Nile River, but it was all the water. All the little ponds and canals and streams and lakes and bowls of water and cups of water and stone basins of water. All of it was turned to blood. If you've ever been hunting, fishing, if you've ever killed a chicken for dinner, cleaned a turkey, whatever it is, there's blood involved. And it's got that smell to it. And it's got that texture to it. Can you imagine the St. John's River turning to real blood and flowing through? Yeah, I mean, the scriptures tell us that the fish are all going to die. I guess the crocodiles could crawl out of it. The alligators there in the Nile River could crawl out, but everything that lives in the water can't live in blood. You can't drink blood. And I was looking and I couldn't find where it was turned back into water, but I believe at some point it was turned back. I don't think the scriptures specifically say, as it does in other places with the frogs and the flies and the fleas and all this stuff, that Moses turned them back. But I think it did at some point, because it later talks about water. But imagine, it even says there in verse 18, the fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. I imagine that growing weary was probably something that happened rather quickly. As you're taking a sip of what you think is river water, and now all of a sudden it's a mouthful of blood. You're going to get pretty tired of that quickly. And so this happens. But the problem was, as they warned Pharaoh, this is going to happen if you don't let my people go, Pharaoh hardened his heart. He hardened his heart. All this land was turned into blood. All this water, rather, was turned into blood. Verse 22, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts, so that Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. There's a lot of people in the world today. As Romans 1 tells us, know that there is a God. They know it from the things around us, that his invisible attributes are clearly seen. And yet the magicians can perform some of the same tricks. And so they harden their heart. They turn their backs from this obvious miracle, because these magicians were able to do the same thing. And so Pharaoh says, oh, yeah, no, they can do the same thing. Your God's not special. However, much like with the snakes that ate, that Moses' snake ate their snake, they could maybe make it into blood, but they couldn't figure out how to make it back into water. And so Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So what they did is they dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water from the Nile. And it says for 7 days in verse 25, after the Lord had struck the Nile. So for at least 7 days, living with that stink of not just the blood in the river and in the water basins and everywhere else, but the smell of dead fish. And having to go out and dig a separate little well from inside the river to get your water. Drinking muddy bank water because you didn't have anything else to drink. The second plague we see is Pharaoh is there and is told, let my people go. And he hardens his heart. No. If you don't, Pharaoh, Moses warns him, if you don't, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be frogs coming. And they're going to cover the land. And at this point, we're not told until later on, but it seems like this is happening to everybody. Not just the Egyptians, but it happened to everybody in this area. Where these frogs come in and they just get everywhere. Frogs are not, they're not particularly dirty, but you don't want to go out and handle frogs and then go eat. But it wasn't just that they were, outside. They were inside, in the house, in the bed, in the dishes that you're going to be cooking with and eating on. They're everywhere. Can you imagine not just having that many frogs everywhere? Can you imagine? I sleep with my mouth open sometimes. Can you imagine waking up with frogs in your mouth? Or waking up with frogs jumping on your face? Can you imagine the noise that they made? We've got insulated house and walls and windows, and you can still hear the stinking frogs outside when it rains. But imagine living in Egypt where you didn't have sealed up houses. Can you imagine just the sound that they were enduring? Because they refused, he sent this plague of frogs, and they're going to get everywhere. In verse 3, he tells them it's going to get in the house, bedroom, in your bed, the house of your servants, the people, and on your ovens, and in your kneading bowls. So this happened. Stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, and this happens. But in verse 7, magicians could do the same thing. They did the same thing. And so as a result, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So in verse 8, Pharaoh calls Moses and Aaron after he's had enough. Plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. He's bargaining with God. Because as you see, Pharaoh thought of himself and the people thought of him as a god. A god on earth that they worshipped. And so he's kind of putting himself on the same playing field. This is different from what Abraham does with kind of bargaining or negotiating with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham wasn't bargaining with God to change God's mind about, what he wanted. He was pleading for people. Whereas Pharaoh, on the other hand, he's acting like, well, this is what God wants, but that's not what I want. So here, how about we meet in the middle? How about we compromise? You want me to let him go completely? No, I'll let him go and make sacrifice to you. But it wasn't even really that he was going to do that. What he really wanted to do was get rid of the frogs. And we know that because as soon as the frogs go away, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he didn't let him go. In verse 15, when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, and the Lord had said. And so Moses and Aaron, they send all the live frogs out into the river. But all these dead frogs just got piled up in the cities and in the towns. So you just spent some time with a river of blood smelling up and the fish, and now you've got all these dead frogs everywhere that you're having to scoop up and make these big stinking piles of frogs. Frogs, you ever stepped on a frog? It's not like stepping on anything else. I mean, it's got bones in it. It's gross. They smell. And so here we've got these piles of dead frogs now. And so we've got the third plague of gnats, and it's one of these things where it's like, all right, would you rather have a river of blood, frogs everywhere, eaten up with gnats, eaten up with flies? Would you rather have boils everywhere? Would you rather have, the livestock dead or hail coming down and killing everything that's out in the field? Or would you rather have it dark for 3 days? Or would you rather your firstborn son die? The firstborn of the livestock die. Which one's worse? So we've got these gnats coming in. Or lice. And this one's different than the other ones. The magicians could turn the rods into snakes, and they could make water into blood, and they could make frogs come up. And just, can you imagine Pharaoh's response? As these magicians, who are these holy men, they could do all these things. Yeah, look, they can do that. Can you make them go away? No? Great. Now we've got more frogs. But here we've got these gnats, these flies, or not flies, but fleas or lice everywhere. The magicians, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do the same thing. They tried in verse 18 by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on the man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." And it's capital G. I imagine they're using the same word that the Hebrews used, that Moses used, that Aaron used when he talks about God. This is God doing this. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And we not listen to them, as the Lord said. 3 times he's hardened his heart because of the proof of these magicians. He didn't really have much of an excuse anymore, though. Here he is. He's got these guys that are doing similar things, so I can sort of prop up my false religion on them. They're telling me that this God is not powerful than the gods that we worship, that this God's not powerful than me. But now they can't do it, and they're telling me, but I'm still going to harden my heart. Doesn't have much of an excuse, and so the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh as he goes to the water." And this was a religious ceremony that Pharaoh would do a couple times a year where he'd go to the Nile. And so he probably wasn't real happy to see Moses and Aaron coming. It was great. Here they come. What are they going to do now? Gives them warning. "Let my people go that they may serve me. Or else, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you, and your servant, and your people, and in your house. And in the house of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, and also on the ground where they stand. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms or flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth." Because God's people are special. God's people are chosen. I don't imagine that these are just the little annoying flies that you have to swat away from food when you're eating a picnic. I kind of picture like the horse flies, the big boys. I don't know that. I imagine that these weren't just little nuisances, but they probably stung. They were probably biting flies. And so God is going to make these flies come into Egypt, but he separated his people. I don't know about you, but I'm imagining like this invisible wall where Israel started their place of living. And the flies are everywhere, but they're not this is God controlling the flight pattern of flies. Because he is the Lord God. And yet Pharaoh hardens his heart. And he tries to bargain with God. Send him away if you plead with me. The same kind of thing that he says time and time again. Go and plead for me. At one point, I'm probably going to miss it, but at one point he even says, "I've sinned. Plead for me." Have you ever known anybody like that? I have. Andy, pray for me. I need some money to stay in the hotel tonight. The next thing I know, he's in trouble again. This isn't real repentance. This is, I'm sorry because I'm in trouble right now. That's what this is. Fine, go please, but take the flies with you. And so, they're allowed to go 3 days to worship. But Moses says, before they get to the 3 days, I'll point here. Pharaoh says, yeah, you can worship in town here. No. Can't do that. Because imagine if you worship a cow, which they did worship that in Egypt. Well, part of the sacrifice to God is sacrificing bulls. The Egyptians are not going to be real happy with Israel sacrificing their sacred cows. Moses says, look, if we do that, they're going to stone us. It's going to turn into a riot. We got to go out 3 days. And Pharaoh says, fine, just don't go very far. That's kind of like the world. That's kind of like the people that say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm not really, I'm not a freak about it. You know what I mean? I'm not crazy about God. I'm not going to make you feel uncomfortable with my religion. I'm going to profess Him. Or, hey, why do you got to go to church on Sunday all the time? Why are you going to this? Why are you doing that? Why are you always talking about God? Just pull it back. That's Egypt talking. That's what Egypt wants us to do. Well, we've got the flies, and then we've got the dead herds in chapter 9. And again, Israel is set apart, where Egypt's herds are dying off, while Israel's are remaining healthy. And one other thing about these. Have you noticed how Moses goes and says, if you don't do this, tomorrow about this time, this is going to happen. There's that idea when you talk with people, and I've seen it, where, what would it take to make you believe? What would it take to make you, if I could perform something, if God could do something to make you believe, what would it be? Well, if you do this and this and this at this certain time, then I'll believe. That's not even really the conversation here, but Moses is saying, hey, this time tomorrow, there's going to be frogs. This time tomorrow, there's going to be gnats and flies. And this time tomorrow, the livestock are going to die. And this time tomorrow, there's going to be hail and boils. And what more proof do you need? I mean, some of these you can kind of chalk up to, well, this is just the seasons. Well, it's the season of frogs. It's been raining a lot, and so there's a lot more frogs. Or, the wind blew in all these locusts, and they ate everything, and we get locusts from time to time, and it's just worse this year. They ate up almost everything. We've had hailstorms here before. This one was just particularly bad. We see that kind of natural order if we were to consider this from today's point of view. But if somebody told you God is going to do this tomorrow, time and time again, how long would it take you to start believing? It didn't take the magicians too long. This is God doing this. It didn't take the rest of the community long to realize, hey, this is happening because the God of heaven is doing this. I don't know of a natural phenomenon, though, as we go to chapter 10, verse 21, with the plague of darkness. Can you imagine what that looked like? This wall of darkness. Now, I don't imagine that the Egyptians could see that Goshen was lit. I don't know how that would have worked. But how much proof more do you need for the Hebrews as they, in a very short time, go out into the wilderness and start complaining that they're going to die out there? If Keystone was the only light around, and you could see the wall of darkness, that would be very alarming. Especially when you've got somebody like Moses and Aaron saying, God's doing this. And Pharaoh still, at this point, God has said he's hardening Pharaoh's heart. And that's not really what this lesson is about. But 2 Thessalonians 2:11, I will send them strong delusions that they should believe a lie. At some point in an Egyptian's life, in the life of the worldly, they're going to have their heart hardened for them. Not because they can't soften their heart. Otherwise, what would be the point of Moses and Aaron coming and asking Pharaoh to let the people go? Pharaoh could have chosen, but at this point in time, God was making his point. We're told time and time again in these passages that God is doing this so that his glory may be known in Egypt and around. And we are told, and later on in Joshua, as they go to the gated city of Jericho, Rahab the harlot. Oh, we've heard about your God and what happened over in Egypt. We know what happened there. We know about the plagues. We've heard about the destruction of the Egyptian army at the Red Sea. We know about those things. God's will was done and he was glorified. Did it have to be like this, though? Did it have to get down to chapter 11 with the death of the firstborn? Moses is there in chapter 11, and it's kind of, you got to kind of read it a couple of times. At least I did. I don't know, maybe not you, but I had to read it a couple of times to get it all straight into who's talking and what and where. But at this point, Moses goes out angry. We're not told specifically. This is chapter 11, verse 8, by the way. Where Moses tells him this, and Pharaoh hardens his heart, and he leaves angry. He leaves the presence of Pharaoh angry. I don't know of many reasons why, because it wasn't like Israel was going to suffer this plague of the death of the firstborn. I suspect, though, because of Moses' character, because of the number of times that Moses had to plead with God to not destroy the Israelites, that Moses is upset because he cares about the Egyptians. Because he's concerned about their safety. That he's concerned that they're going to die. Are we concerned about the Egyptians today? When we go to someone and they've hardened their heart and they've turned their back and now it's almost to the point of no return for them, that they're not going to listen no matter what we say or do. It doesn't matter that we've shown them the wonders of God. We've proven to them with the evidence that is in the Bible, that we've shown them in the world around us that there is a God, and yet they continue to harden their heart, and we know what's coming. It's more than just the death of the firstborn. If you're not in Goshen, if you don't have the blood of the Lamb painted on your doorpost, and if you haven't sat down to eat of the Passover feast, then you're going to die. Moses is not happy with Pharaoh. So they leave. They leave rich. They asked their neighbors in the Egyptian community for stuff, and they just gave it to them. Gold, silver. And they go out there and they're pinned against the Red Sea and this oncoming chariot army. And God tells them, stretch out that staff, that famous staff. And he parts this Red Sea. And they cross over, and the Egyptian army follows behind. And then God brings that water down on top of them. This ultimate final destruction. I wonder what would have happened to Egypt if they had obeyed. What would have happened to Egypt if they had listened to Moses? After they saw that first sign, after they saw the sign of the blood, or the frogs, or the gnats, All those times that Pharaoh hardened his heart, what if he had just listened and let him go? Would God have been glorified? Yes, he would have been. What would have happened to Egypt as a nation? Now, Egypt never again took a role on the world stage after this. Even now. They weren't a real power. They're not a real power now. How many times do we turn our back on God, even as Christians, and refuse to do the things that he wants us to do? Are we giving up blessings as a result of that? How many opportunities do we miss telling the lost? But there's a time coming when it's not just frogs and gnats and locusts, which really, yeah, those are a nuisance. Nobody died from those. They were even warned about the hail coming. If you're out in the field, if you've got stuff out there, it's going to die. And so they came in, and if you listened to Moses, then nobody died. But then we've got this death of the firstborn. And then we've got a man that has so hardened his heart to God that even after they've left, after the death of the firstborn, he says, what are we doing? We just let them go. Let's saddle up, boys, and go get them. And they didn't come back from the Red Sea. Many of us have crossed the Red Sea. We've left the bondage of Egypt, and we've crossed through the Red Sea, meaning the blood of Christ. We're Christians. And maybe we're wandering in the wilderness right now. Are you the kind of Christian that's going to complain and question about God? Or are you going to be one that is actively seeking to do his will? I hope you're not back in Egypt, though. Because there is a time coming that if you're not a part of God's chosen people, there won't be any more decisions to make. He's coming again, and he's victorious. He was victorious over the mighty Egyptian nation, and he was victorious time and time again. Be on God's side. Join his Christian army in baptism, washing away your sins, calling on his name. Won't you come as we stand?